Good evening, dear students. Welcome to the English Canvas. Today we are diving deep into Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, but with a special focus on answer writing strategies. This lecture is designed especially for students who want to tackle previous year questions effectively. We'll go step by step, discussing the key points, structuring your answers, and important tips to help you write precise, insightful, and high scoring answers, whether it's themes, characters, symbolism, or critical perspective. We'll see how to present your answers in a way that impresses the examiners. So, before we begin, if you found this helpful, then don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends and classmates, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss any of our detailed literature lectures. So grab your notebooks, stay attentive, and let's master the art of answer writing on Heart of Darkness. So the first question is, would you agree with Chinua Achebe's view that Conrad consistently promotes racist stereotypes of Africa and Africans in the Heart of Darkness? Give a reason answer. So, सबसे पहले you need to understand Achebe's critique. So, in this point, you can write Chinua Achebe's in his famous essay, An Image of Africa. इनका एक essay है An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which was published in 1977. तो आप उसका reference यहाँ पर लिख सकते हैं. That essay argues, और वही चीज़ को यहाँ पर भी क्वेश्चन में भी पूछा गया है. So that the essay and image of Africa, racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, argues that Conrad portrays Africa as a savage, primitive, and uncivilized continent. So Achebe claims that Africans are largely dehumanized. So Achebe claims that Africans are largely dehumanized, often represented as faceless masses, background characters, and or mere extensions of the environment. So Conrad is criticized for presenting Europe as the center of rationality and morality, while Africa is shown as a place of darkness, danger, and moral ambiguity. Right? Second point, evidence from the text. So Africa is a blank space or dark continent. Conrad rarely provides names or individual identities for African characters. They are often described in terms of physicality rather than personal or intellect. So you can give some of the examples like the African helmsmen, cannibals, or the ship, and the other native characters are presented as almost animalistic. Example 4, they were nothing but black shadows moving in the forest. So Marlow's description often uses metaphors of darkness, heat, and chaos to depict Africa, reinforce the primitive stereotype, right? And there is a contrast with Europeans in the text. European characters, even morally the ambiguous skirts, are described in complex, intellectual, and reflective terms, giving them individuality and agency, right? Point third in, you need to collect some points in Conrad's defense. So some critics argue that Conrad is not racist intentionally, but uses Africa as a symbolic landscape for the exploration of human nature, evil, and moral ambiguity. Marlowe's narrative sometimes critiques European colonialism, highlighting exploitation and brutality of Europeans, which complicates the idea of a purely racist worldview. The novel can also be read as a critique of imperialism, where the darkness is not just Africa but the moral corruption of European colonialists, right? Fourth point is balanced reason answer. So to write a balanced reason answer, you need to add some points which are जो कि आपके ना एचबे से कुछ अग्री करेंगे और कुछ नहीं करेंगे. तो जो अग्री करेंगे वो है that Conrad often reduces Africans to stereotype failing to portray them as full human beings with individuality, and the language used in the language used to describe Africa and its people is often derogatory, dehumanizing and Eurocentric. और जब disagree करोगे तो तब आप बोल सकते हो, लिख सकते हो कि द नॉवेल्स फोकस इज मोर ऑन यूरोपियन मॉरल डार्कनेस देन ऑन अफ्रीकन आइडेंटिटी. सम डिपिक्शंस लाइक द कैनिबल्स, they are disciplined and cooperation on the ships, right? And these depiction hint at Conrad's ambivalence, showing Africans as capable and resourceful, right? फिफ्थ पॉइंट है आपका जिसमें आप कुछ की पॉइंट्स ऐड करोगे, जैसे कि मेंशन एचबी's सेंट्रल आर्ग्यूमेंट about racism and stereotype. It can provide specific example, मतलब you can provide specific examples from the text, like the African characters, the African mistress, and their descriptions and metaphors. You can highlight the contrast between European and African representation, right? And you need to discuss Conrad's possible intention and critique of imperialism. And you can conclude your answer with these points with a balanced viewpoint which acknowledges both Achebe's Achebe's critique and interpretive complexity of Conrad's narrative, right? सो कंक्लूजन में आप लिख सकते हैं कि वाइल कॉन्रैड्स portrayal of Africa and Africans often relies on dehumanizing stereotypes and reflecting the Eurocentric mindset of his time. This is a closer reading. We have a closer reading that reveals a nuanced narrative that critiques European colonialism and suggest that the darkness depicts is as much Europeans as African, right? अब क्वेश्चन नंबर 2 पर चलते हैं. Yes. Heart of Darkness projects the image of Africa, the other world. This is very important. The antithesis of Europe and therefore of civilization. So discuss Conrad's portrayal of Africa and the Africans in the light of statement. So सबसे पहले you need to understand the question. This question focus on Africa as a symbolic other, right? And contrasting with Europe, the antithesis of Europe, right? So, Conrad often presents Africa not just as a geographical space but as a metaphorical backdrop for exploring moral and psychological themes. So, the key idea is Europeans are civilized, reasonable, and order, and Africans, he expressed Africans as wilderness, chaos, and darkness. So, you can add some other points in your answer. Africa as the other world, जो कि क्वेश्चन में मेंशनड है. सो अफ्रीका एज द अदर वर्ल्ड में आप लिख सकते हैं कि अफ्रीका इज डिपिक्टेड एज मिस्टीरियस, थ्रेटनिंग एंड अनटेम्ड, इवोकिंग फियर, फैसिनेशन एंड मॉरल कन्फ्यूजन. द नॉवल में डिस्क्रिप्शन भी है. So the description in the novel often emphasis like impenetrable forest, thick darkness, fog, fog and oppressive heat, unfamiliar and exoticized landscapes, highlighting a contrast with Europe's civilized world. So, Marlow repeatedly refers to the Congo as a blank space or heart of darkness that reinforce Africa's role as the antithesis of familiar European norms, right? Second is Africans in Conrad Conrad's portrayal. So this is very important. Africans in Conrad's portrayal. Conrad described Africans are often presented as faceless, silent masses contributing to the otherworldly atmosphere. They are shown off in terms of physicality, with movements, gestures, and sounds rather than thoughts or individuality, and in terms of savage stereotypes, so cannibalistic tendencies, emotional spontaneity, or stupid superstitious behavior, right? For example, the chain gang of African workers, the chain gangs, and the local tribes are described as almost part of the landscape, which emphasize their alienness from European norms, right? Third, you can add your in your answer there is a contrast with Europe. So Europe represents order, reason, and moral codes. The political and social structure is very good in with them. They have literacy and technologically advancement. But Africa represents chaos, mystery, moral ambiguity. आप ये सब लिख लीजिए क्योंकि यहाँ सारा लिखना पॉसिबल नहीं है. Africa represents chaos, mystery, and moral ambiguity. There's a space in Africans where European norms are destabilized and the dark side of human nature emerges. So Conrad uses this uh, contrast to explore universal human instincts, but it simultaneously constructs Africa as a symbolic antithesis to civilization, right? Fourth, you can add some critical perspectives in your answer. First of all, you can add Achebe's critique. Africa is dehumanized. Conrad reinforces racist stereotypes by making Africans the other against which European morality is measured. There is alternative reading which says Africa is also a narrative device for examining European imperialism, European greed, and moral decay. The otherworldly depiction can be symbolic rather than literal, right? Some of the key points you can include in your answer writing as Africa as a symbol other, which contrasts European civilization, right? You can use specific example like Congo River, forest, darkness, chain gangs, and the native tribes. You need to highlight stereotypical representation of Africans. You can discuss a symbolic function of Africa for exploring moral, psychological, and colonial themes in your answer. You can include a critical balance while the depiction reinforces the idea of Africa as the antithesis. It also critiques European colonialism, right? So you can conclude your answer by writing Conrad projects Africa as a land fundamentally different from Europe and other land marked by darkness, mystery, and chaos. But this portrayal, while reflecting Eurocentric biases, also serves as a mirror to expose the moral corruption and imperial greed of Europeans. Right? चलिए क्वेश्चन 3 पर चलते हैं. The yarns of seamen to have a direct simplicity, but Marlow was not typical. So this is the reference to context from the text. Comment on the layers of meaning in Marlowe's narrative in the heart of darkness. So first of all, you need to understand the question. ये बिल्कुल शुरू का है when Conrad begins the novel. with the frame narrative where unnamed seamen tells simple, straightforward stories. Like, and there's a character Charles Marlow. However, he is different from typical seamen. His narrative is complex, layered, and reflective, blending personal experience, philosophical insights, and moral contemplation. So, this question asks us to explore how Marlowe's storytelling differs and why it is significant as well. So, first of all, you need to write the characteristics of typical seaman story. So Siemens tales are linear. Their stories are factual, entertaining, often about adventure and maritime life. They focus on surface level events, lacking deeper psychological or moral insight. The other seamen in the frame narrative share anecdotes that amuse the crew without exploring ethical or existential dimensions, right? Secondly, you can write about Marlowe as a Marlowe's as a non-typical narrator. Marlowe's narrative is reflective, introspective, and morally complex. His storytelling includes digressions and philosophical reflections on imperialism and human nature and morality, symbolism and allegory. Example for the Congo as the heart of darkness, representing the human psyche, not just geography. There's a moral ambiguity. Kurds is both admirable and horrifying. Europe is both civilized and corrupt. For example, Marlowe's account of Kurt's final words, the horror, is layered with meaning which is personal, moral, and existential. The third point is layers of meaning. Layers of meaning in Marlowe's narrative. So we have different layers like adventurous narrative. ये आप लिख लीजिए. The first is adventure narrative. At the surface, it's a tale of a journey along the Congo River. The second is psychological exploration, which explores the effects of isolation, greed, and power on human consciousness. The third is moral and philosophical reflection. So it questions civilization, savagery, and the darkness with humans. The fourth is critique of colonialism, which exposes the brutality and hypocrisy of European imperialism. The fifth is narrative technique. So the frame story adds distance and subjectivity, forcing readers to question reliability and perspective. So with these points you can conclude your answer. First of all, you need to begin with the contrast, typically Siemens simplicity versus Marlowe's complexity. You need to discuss the multiple layers which I have just discussed. Multiple layers which are adventure, psychological, moral, and political. You need to give examples for Marlowe's reflection, description of Africa and Kurds. You need to highlight narrative techniques, first person, which are first person frame, digression, and symbolic imagery. And at last, you can conclude with Marlowe's role as a thoughtful observer, not just a storyteller. So you can conclude your answer by writing, while typical seamen tell straightforwardness, straightforward stories of maritime adventure, Marlowe's narrative in Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness is deeply layered, combining personal experience, more reflection, psychological insight, and political critique, making him a narrator who transcends the simplicity of traditional seafaring tales. Right? अब चलिए क्वेश्चन नंबर 4 पर चलते हैं. The narrative of Heart of Darkness excludes women from the colonial enterprise as well as its critique. Discuss the representation of women in the novel in the light of this statement. So, first of all, you need to understand the question. The question Actually, this novel largely focuses on men, right? This novel focuses on men, imperialism, and moral dilemmas, with women either absent or marginal. So the question asks us to analyze how women are represented and what their exclusion tells us about the novel's perspective on colonialism. So सबसे पहले आपको यहाँ पर डिस्कस करना है women as peripheral figures. So women appear sparingly and often symbolically rather than as active participants. So यहाँ पर कुछ फीमेल कैरेक्टर्स हैं जिनको हमने नॉवल पढ़ा, जैसे कि मार्लो की आंटी, मार्लोज आंट. She helps Marlow secure a position with the company. Her character symbolizes European idealism and naivety about colonial realities. Her character represents civilizing mission rhetoric but is disconnected from the brutality she unknowingly supports. The second female character is the intended, जो वो थी ना, क्या बोलते हैं, मिस्टर कर्स्ट की फियोंसे. एक वो कैरेक्टर है, ये भी काफ़ी एब्सेंट है बिल्कुल. लास्ट में नॉवल के एंड में इनकी अपेयरेंस होती है. शी लिव्स इन यूरोप, आइडलाइज कर्ट्स विदाउट नोइंग हिज मॉरल डीके. शी इज़ अ symbol of innocence, idealism, and unattainable purity. She reinforces the contrast between European illusions and African realities. And the African women, the African women almost entirely absent or represented stereotypically, example for cannibalistic rituals or nameless figures. Secondly, आपको ये women exclusion के reasons बताने हैं. So the colonial enterprise is depicted as a male dominated space. Exploration, trade, and exploitation, trade, and exploitations are male spheres. Conrad's critique of imperialism is focused on European men's morality and power. Women are largely excluded from both participation and critique. Women function symbolically rather than actively as moral ideals or mirrors reflecting men's choices as a part of European domesticity, contrasting with African wilderness. Thirdly, you can add symbolic role of women. So, women embody European values, morality, and the civilized world, standing in stark contrast to the chaos of Africa. They highlight the distance between European perception and the colonial reality, which emphasizes how Europe remains insulated from the consequences of imperialism. So, you need to begin your answer by noting that male centric narratives of colonial enterprise. उसके बाद you can discuss three main female figures like Marlowe's aunt, the intended, Kurt's intended, and the African women or the absent thereof. And you can highlight their symbolic or and ideological roles rather than agency. And उसके बाद you can explain how women's exclusion reflects the male dominance in exploration and exploitation. Conrad's focus on moral and psychological critique of men. So you can conclude by noting the contrast between symbolic European women and absent African women, reinforcing themes of imperialism and morality and distance from reality. So you can conclude your answer by writing, in Heart of Darkness, women are largely peripheral, right? And symbolic, and embodying European ideals and innocence while being excluded from both the colonial enterprise and its moral critique, thereby highlighting the male dominated focus of imperialism and Conrad's emphasis on men's moral and psychological journeys. चलिए क्वेश्चन नंबर 5 पर चलते हैं. The world of Heart of Darkness depicts darkness of many kinds. Critically examine this statement. So first of all, you need to understand the question. Heart of Darkness is not just about geographical darkness. It explores moral, psychological, social, and political darkness. This question asks for multi-dimensional analysis of the types of darkness in the novel. So first of all, you need to mention types of darkness in the novel, right? The first one is, ये आप लिख लीजिए. The first type of darkness is geographical darkness. The Congo River and its dense forest represent a literal physical darkness. Africa is described as a mysterious, impenetrable spaces, like the edges of black and mysterious wilderness. And this description, this mysterious description of darkness, creates an atmosphere of fear, uncertainty, and danger. तो पहला टाइप क्या था? Geographical darkness. दूसरा है moral darkness. Moral darkness is associated with greed, corruption, and particularly in European imperialist. Kurtz embodies moral ambiguity. He is charismatic and eloquent yet commits atrocities. His famous last words, the horror, reflects the collapse of morality. The third type of darkness is psychological. Psychological darkness. Marlow experience Yes, Marlow experiences alienation, isolation, and existential dread during his journey. Darkness represents the inner struggle of human conscience and the confrontation with primal instincts. Right? Fourth type of darkness is political and social darkness. So the Belgian colonial enterprise exposes systematic exploitation and dehumanization, bureaucratic inefficiency, cruelty towards Africans, and unbridled capitalism reflect societal corruption. Fifth is symbolic or philosophical darkness. So Conrad uses Africa as a symbolic canvas to explore universal human tendencies toward evil, hypocrisy, and self deception. So, darkness is a metaphor for the hidden and shadowy aspects of civilization and human nature. उसके बाद यू कैन ऐड द की एविडेंस फ्रॉम द टेक्स्ट, जैसे कि इसमें मार्लोज ऑब्जर्वेशन है, मार्लोज ऑब्जर्वेशंस ऑफ ruined stations and abandoned machinery. They illustrate moral and social decay. कर्ट्स का जो इंटीरियर मोनोलॉग है, उसका इंटीरियर मोनोलॉग एंड एक्शन शोज द साइकोलॉजिकल एंड एथिकल कोलैप्स एंड द डिस्क्रिप्शन ऑफ कॉन्गोज डेंस फॉरेस्ट, oppressive heat, and endless river journey that establish geographical and symbolic darkness. तो आप ये वाले एविडेंस को यूज़ कर सकते हो ये जो कुछ टाइप्स ऑफ डार्कनेस इनको रिप्रेजेंट करने के लिए. सबसे पहले आपको डार्कनेस को मतलब ये जब आप आंसर लिखेंगे, सबसे पहले आपको डार्कनेस को एक्सप्लेन करना है. डार्कनेस को एज मल्टी डायमेंशनल, जैसे ये जियोग्राफिकल है, मॉरल है, साइकोलॉजिकल है, पॉलिटिकल है, सोशल है, सिंबॉलिक और फिलोसफिकल है. फिर इनकी लिंकेजेस बताने की, लाइक हाउ फिजिकल डार्कनेस रिफ्लेक्ट्स और एम्पलीफाइज मॉरल एंड साइकोलॉजिकल डार्कनेस. उसके बाद यू नीड टू एम्फसाइज कॉनराड्स यूज ऑफ सिम्बोलिज्म एंड एलेगरी, राइट? And you can conclude by noting that the darkness is noticed confined to Africa but reflects universal human and societal flaws. So you can conclude your answer by writing, in Heart of Darkness, Conrad depicts the darkness of multiple levels. Multiple levels like geographical, moral, psychological, social, and symbolic, which reveals the complexities of human nature, the corruption of imperialism, and the universal presence of moral and existential ambiguity, making the novel a profound exploration of darkness in all its forms. Right? चलिए, question number 6. What is central to the Heart of Darkness is the question of form and narrative more than curse or colorism. Do you agree? Discuss. So this question focuses on Conrad's narrative technique and literary form rather than just the plot or characters. Conrad's novel is experimental in structure. It's a frame narrative, non-linear storytelling, and a focus on perspective and subjectivity. This question asks whether the form and narrative techniques are central to the novel's meaning, even more than characters like Kurtz or the theme of colonialism. So, सबसे पहले you need to write about narrative form. Narrative form in the novel, the first type is frame narrative. So the story begins with an anonymous seaman on the Thames River who listens to Marlow's tale. It adds Frame narrative adds distance, ambiguity, and complexity. Marlowe's story is filtered through multiple layers, and the readers are reminded that the story is subjective, mediated, and interpretive. Right. The second, uh, the second type is non-linear and fragmented structure. So Marlowe's narrative is digressive, moving between past and present thoughts and events. It creates a layered understanding, emphasizing perception and reflection over chronological storytelling. The third type is psychological depth. So this form of narrative allows Conrad to explore Marlowe's consciousness, his ethical dilemmas, and his perception of Kurds. So the narrative technique mirrors the moral ambiguity and uncertainty of the colonial enterprise. So there is a use of symbolism and allegory, right? So the river journey, use of symbolism and allegory, the river journey, darkness, and curds, all are filtered through Marlowe's narrative lens, creating symbolic and thematic depth. Form and style amplify the exploration of evil, human nature, and civilization. Third point is Kurds and colonialism versus form. So Kurd is a central character morally and symbolically, but his meaning is shaped by Marlowe's narrative. Colonialism is a major theme, but the critique emerges through how the story is told rather than direct exposition. And versus Conrad's innovative narrative form, that is subjectivity, indirect commentary, which is layered storytelling is there, and what gives the novel is its literary power. So यहाँ पर आप कुछ critical perspectives भी लिख सकते हो, like some critics argue form. So some critics argue that form and narrative are inseparable from meaning. The story of Kurds and imperialism is meaningful only because of Marlowe's reflective and subjective. Sorry for the disturbance. The story of Kurds and imperialism is meaningful only because of Marlowe's reflection and subjective narration. Other highlights: characters and colonial critique are central, and form merely enhances the reader's experience. So, you can conclude your answer with these points. First of all, you need to explain the frame narrative and its effect on perspective of the novel. You can discuss the non-linear digressive storytelling and psychological depth. You can show how symbolism and allegory are mediated by form. You can compare the role of narrative and the characters versus you can compare the roles of narrator and the other characters, and you can conclude your answer with a balanced view, acknowledging form's centrality but not ignoring Kurds or colonial critique. So you can conclude your answer by writing that while Kurds and colonialism provide the content and thematic focus of Heart of Darkness, it's a Conrad's innovation use of form and narrative. It's a frame story, subjective perspective, and non-linear structure that is central to the novel. And it's a shape meaning, and the novel is shaping meaning, creating ambiguity, and allowing a profound exploration of human nature and imperialism. So this is all about क्वेश्चन 6. चलिए क्वेश्चन नंबर 7 पर चलते हैं. सबसे पहले आपको क्वेश्चन समझना पड़ेगा. डिस्कस द मल्टी लेयर्ड आई थिंक ये हम कर चुके हैं डिस्कस, तो इसको बार बार तो डिस्कस नहीं करेंगे। इस क्वेश्चन में भी यही है कि मल्टी लेयर सिग्निफिकेंस जो है मार्लो के ट्रेवल का, वो आप डिस्कस कीजिए। इसमें मैं ज़्यादा कुछ नहीं बताऊंगी। देखिए, सबसे पहले क्वेश्चन को समझना है कि मार्लो की जो जर्नी है अलॉन्ग विथ कॉन्गो रिवर इज़ मोर देन अ फिजिकल वॉयज, राइट? दिस इज़ वेरी ट्रू। इट्स अ सिम्बॉलिक एंड रिफ्लेक्टिव ऑफ साइकोलॉजिकल, मॉरल एंड फिलोसफिकल डायमेंशन। द क्वेश्चन आस्क्ड टू एक्सप्लोर द लेयर्स ऑफ मीनिंग इन हिज ट्रेवल्स। जैसे कि सबसे पहला है फिजिकल, फिजिकल और द geographical layer, right? So, journey through Africa from the coast to the interior, navigating the Congo River, it represents exploration unknown, of an unknown and dangerous landscape full of natural obstacle. It reflects the physical realities of imperialism and harsh environment. Yes, and logistic difficulties are there, and the labor of the labor from Africa. So, one second. Hmm. The labor of African workers. So it reflects its physical reality, the physical and geographical realities of the land, right? Second is psychological layer. Psychological layer. The voyage exposes Marlowe to alienation, isolation, and existential reflection. Marlowe observes human behavior under extreme conditions like greed, quality, fear, and obedience. So, this journey is a mirror to Marlowe's inner mind, revealing his doubts, moral conflicts, and contemplation about human nature. The third is moral or ethical layer. So, through this journey, Marlowe witnesses the moral corruption of European imperialists, especially Kurds. He confronts ethical dilemmas, complexity in exploitation, the limits of intervention, and the judgment of others' morality. So, the voyage illustrates the gradual confrontation with the darkness within humanity. The fourth is symbolic and, sorry for the handwriting, symbolic and the philosophical layer. So Congo river as a symbol जो है ये path है into the heart of darkness of human soul and civilization. So the voyage represent a journey from civilization to savagery, from known to unknown, and from clarity to ambiguity. So symbolic of universal confrontation with human nature and existential realities, right? अगला है political and colonial layer. So the this travel reveals the exploitation, sorry, this travel reveals the exploitation and dehumanization inherent in European colonialism. This journey is not only physical but also an observation of imperial greed, bureaucratic inefficiency, and violence. So you can use these points to write a good answer. You can begin with Marlowe's journey as the central narrative of the novel. Later, then you can discuss physical journey, giving examples of the river, forest, and stations. You can explore psychological and moral dimension like isolation and ethical dilemmas. You can highlight symbolic and philosophical meanings like the heart of darkness as the universal human condition. You can include colonial critique as revealed during travels, and conclude your answer by emphasizing multi-layered significance, combining physical, moral, and psychological and symbolical aspects. At last, you can write Marlowe's travels in Heart of Darkness operate on multiple levels: physical, psychological, moral, symbolic, political, making his journey not only a passage through the African landscape but also a profound exploration of human nature, ethical complexity, and darkness inherent in civilization and imperialism. Right? So, this is about this is so thank you so much for joining today's lecture. Next class में हम एक नया टॉपिक शुरू करेंगे.